In this video, our goal is to implement the edit functionality for our to-do app. You may recall we introduced the idea of CRUD earlier: create, read, update, and delete. What we've built so far is create, read, and delete, but we don't have a way to update or edit an item in our to-do list. What we're going to build in this video is the ability to single tap on one item and go into a separate screen where we can edit and modify the item, tap save, and be taken back to our list of items here with the item updated. We want to make sure that this is registered on single tap rather than long press. Long press is reserved for deleting an item. The way we're going to go about doing this is to create a new activity which is for editing an item. An activity, you can think of it like a screen. So what we work on so far is the main activity. We're going to create a new activity called edit activity, on which we'll have the ability for the user to modify that to-do item. So in order to do that, go into the directory where you have main activity, and let's create a new activity. So there should be an option here to create a new empty activity. We'll call this edit activity. The layout name, let's leave it as default, which will be activity edit, and tap finish. So this is going to create some scaffolding similar to what we had with main activity. So you'll see that not only did it create an edit activity.java file, but it also created a layout. So the first thing we'll want to do is construct the layout for our edit activity. So if you go into the XML file here, you'll notice again that we have the design tab and text tab. So instead of working with constraint layout, let's change this to be a relative layout, just because relative layout is a bit simpler and easier to work with. Edit activity is going to consist of two simple components. One will be a text field on which we'll populate the contents of our to-do item, and second, a button where the user can save the text. So first, let's drag and drop our plain text, our edit text. Let's get rid of the text person name because this is going to be a normal text field. We can leave the text blank, although what we're going to do when we actually add this in our view is initially populate the edit text with the text of our to-do item. In any case, let's add a hint just in case it becomes empty, the text field becomes empty, and we'll say update the item. We'll give it a descriptive ID. We call it ET item. And let's make the margin start and margin top, all of it be 0 dp. Great. And one other thing we can do is actually make it span the whole width of the screen. So let's make the width match parent. Now let's drag down a button. And our goal here is we want to align this to be below the edit text and then all the way to the right side of the screen. So the way we'll do that is we'll have a margin of 0 dp. And we'll give this a descriptive ID as well. Button save. And so the text should be communicating to the user that we're updating or saving the contents that they've written out here. Great. So let's go back now to the edit activity and actually grab references to the views that we have in our activity. So first, let's save these as variables. So we'll have an edit text called ET item and a button, and we'll call the button ET save. So after we set the content view, then we can actually grab references to the views in our layout. Make sure that the ID that you are referring here matches up with the ID that you placed in your activity edit XML file. Okay, one other thing we can do is let's make the title of this activity more descriptive so the user knows where they are in our application. The way you can do that is say get support action bar and set the title be edit item. So this is the basic functionality of our edit activity, and we'll flesh it out more once we're actually able to navigate there. In order to be able to open up the edit activity, the idea is that when I tap on any item in my list, I should open up the new activity. We're going to employ the same strategy as what we did for deleting an item. The key is we need to know what position at which our list was clicked on so we can pass the correct item into our edit activity. So we're going to do something quite similar to the on-long click listener. Instead, we're going to have a single click listener, which is just a normal click listener. So what we'll do is if you open up items adapter, we want to attach a click listener on our text view. Let's fix the indentation here. But the idea is that we want to define a similar interface which will communicate back to main activity and inform us what position was tapped. So let's define another interface. So we should get a handle of the click listener in the constructor. And when Android notifies us that the text view has been clicked, we can invoke the method on our interface. And we need to pass in the position by calling getAdapterPosition. So now going back to main activity, we need to pass in the third parameter, which is an on-click listener. Let's define that up here. And we'll fill that in shortly, but let's pass this in so we can see that this resolved correctly. And here is where we actually want to open up edit activity. So before we go too deep into opening up the new activity, let's just prove to ourselves that we're actually able to get inside this method when we expect to. So when we do a single tap on an item, we should execute this method. One way to check that is by actually adding a log statement. So the tag of the log can be main activity, that's the first parameter. And the second parameter can be the actual message that we want to log. So we'll say single click at position, and we'll pass in the position here. So if we run this, let's actually check our assumption that this is hooked up properly. So if I open up logcat at the bottom here, and then I only care about, Android will have a bunch of logs. The logs that we care about are the ones from main activity. So I'll just filter for that. So now if I do a single tap on an item, I'd expect to see this log statement, single click at position, along with the actual position. So you can see that we are getting there. If I tap, then the first item has a position of 0, and the second one has a position of 1. So once we know that the item has been clicked, there are a few things that need to happen. First, we want to create the new activity, the new edit activity. Second, we want to pass the relevant data to the edit activity. And finally, we want to actually tell the system to display the edit activity. So starting off with creating a new activity, the way we'll do this is with something called an intent. You can think of an intent like a request to the Android system. In our case, it's a request simply to open up another activity defined in our application, but you can actually have intents to many things. For example, you can have an intent to open up a URL, which would open up the browser on your phone, or an intent to open up the camera. So intents are a very core part of the Android system, and I'd encourage you to learn more about them. CodePath has an extensive guide about intents that you can read more about it right here. So to create a new activity, we're going to create a new intent. And the intent takes in two parameters in the way that we'll use it. First is the context from which we're calling this intent. And second is destination. Where do we want to go? So the really important distinction here is the main activity.this versus edit activity.class. Main activity.this is referring to the current instance of main activity, which is this class that we're in right now. Edit activity.class is referring to the class edit activity. There's no instance, we're just indicating to the intent system that this is the class that we would like to go to. And the Android system will take care of creating that for us. Next, we want to pass in data along with our intent so we can actually access this data in the edit activity. So of course, we'll need to pass in the actual contents of the to-do item. In addition to that, we'd also like to pass in the position of our item so that when the user finishes editing the item, we know what has been updated back in our main activity. The way you pass data into an intent is with put extra, and you can see that it takes in two parameters. One is a key and the other is a value. And there's a bunch of different values that you could pass in. The key is always a string. So let's define a key at the top of the file that we'll use to reference not only here, but also on the receiving end in edit activity to know the data that we're getting out. So I'm just going to leave that blank for now. And we're going to define a couple of different keys here. So one will be key item text, and then we'll make this a string. So we'll call it item text. And then another one, which is key item position. And these are both going to be strings. So the first data that we'll put in is going to be the text, followed by the key item text along with the actual text. So that's going to be looking into our model list, which is items, and getting the relevant position out of it. And additionally, we'll put in the position, which is simply the position that is passed in as a parameter to this method. Now we have to display the activity. The way we do that is with start activity, and you'll see that there's actually a couple of different ways that start activity can be used. What we're interested in is start activity for result. And the reason is because we actually expect a result, namely the updated to-do item. So that's the result we expect back from edit activity. This method takes in a couple parameters. First is the intent that we just defined above. Then it's the request code. A request code uniquely identifies the request for a different activity. In this instance, it's not that valuable because we only have one intent in the whole application, but you can imagine how when you have multiple activities, you would need the ability to distinguish between different intents. So for now, let's define this as a code up top that we'll define in a bit. And let's just make it 20. It's kind of arbitrary, whatever you want to pick here, because we only have one activity, as we mentioned. So this is a great spot at which we can pause and test what we have so far. So let's run our application. And now if I tap on any item, we can see that we do navigate successfully to a new activity, which has a title called edit item, and it shows the edit text along with button that we had set up in activity edit. The next step is to actually use the data that we passed into our intent in the edit activity. let's open up edit activity, and the way we'll get a handle on the data that we passed in is by calling this method getIntent. From here, we can actually retrieve data using the various methods here. So to get the text of the item, we can call getStringExtra and pass in the key that we defined in main activity. And whatever we passed in, that's what we should pre-populate the edit text to have. So instead of it being blank, we should actually populate it with the text of the item. Let's test if that works. So I'm running the application, I tap item 1, and you can see that item 1 was filled in properly here. Let's now add a click listener on the button. So there's a couple things that we need to do here. The button is clicked when the user is done editing. So at this point, when the user has tapped on the button, we want to return back to the main activity. So again, the way we'll do that is by using intents. So the first thing we'll do is create an intent which will contain the results of whatever the user has modified. Then we'll pass the results which is basically the edits that the user has made. Set the result of the intent, and then we want to finish the activity, which is a way to close the screen, the current screen, and go back. So creating an intent, we'll do the same thing as similar to what we did before. This time, we'll leave this as an empty constructor because we're only using it as a shell to pass data. And now we're going to pass the data, which is the result of what the user has done. So whatever modifications are made in the edit text, we want to pass that as the same key as what we had before. So we want to grab the result of the edit text as the value here. We also want to pass in the position. And this won't have changed. The user doesn't have the ability to change it, but we do need it just so that the main activity can figure out at what point the list should be updated. We've entered into edit activity as a result of start activity for result. We need to define what was the result. And in this case, we can use result OK, which is a predefined in the Android system, and pass in the intent. And finally, we can call the method finish. What that'll do is it'll finish this current edit activity, close the screen, and go back to main activity, which is exactly what we want. Let's try it out. So if I tap on item 3, and then I might do whatever modification and click save. So as expected, we did go back to the main activity. Nothing actually got updated because we haven't hooked that up yet, but we did indeed close the edit activity as expected. Now we want to handle the result of the edit activity. The way you can do this is by overriding a method. I'll do it down here, right below the onCreate method, but it doesn't really matter where you do it. And the method that we want to override is called onActivityResult. So the purpose here is handle the result of the edit activity. So let's get rid of the initial implementation. The first thing we should check, even though it's a little bit redundant in our example because we only have one activity, is to check if the actual request code matches up with the request code that we passed in, which is the edit text code. So let's do that. In addition, we want to make sure that the result code is OK and not some error result. So the result code should be result okay, and we need the request code to match up with what we had before. And if this is not the case, let's just log a warning. Okay, but in most cases, we should enter into the if block. And there's a few things that we want to do here. First is we want to retrieve the updated text value. Then we want to extract the original position of the edited item from the key position. So this is getting the value, which is the updated contents of the item. This is getting the position at which we did the modification. String item text is data dot get string extra, and we'll pass in key item text. So the extras that we passed in edit activity show up in the intent data. Then we can get the position here. Get int extra, and we'll pass in the position. Now what we need to do is update the model with the new item text. So we want to update the model at the right position that we just retrieved. Once we do that, we need to notify the adapter so that the recycler view knows that something has changed. Then we can persist the changes like normal. So updating the model is simply a question of modifying the items array list. So we have a set method. We'll pass in the position along with the updated text. Then we'll notify the adapter. And there's the method called notify item changed. And we'll indicate that the place that's been changed is at position. And finally, we can persist the changes just by calling save items. So we can rewrite to our data.txt file. Finally, it might be helpful just to show the user a toast again, indicating that they have updated the item successfully. So the first parameter is context. The second is the message that we want to show. And the third parameter is the length. And finally, we want to call show on it so it actually shows up on the screen. Let's try running that. So if I take item 3 and I say item has been updated, you save that, and now you can see that we got the toast, and indeed we do see that the text has changed to be item has been updated.